Hey, what's up? You're here today with Nick the Informative Fisherman, and today I'll be covering the basics of bass lures and when not to use them, and their names and what they are used for. An example of some of my lures that I have here. First off, we have the Topwater bait, your crankbaits, jerkbaits, the jig. This little attachment right here is called the pig, if you ever hear anybody say that. Your Buzzbaits, your Spinnerbaits, and your spoons. Okay, first off we have the Topwater bait. This is a Zara spook. Use the dark colors when it's brighter out and the lighter colors when it's darker and overcasty to cause a better silhouette. I like to use these guys when it's a little windier and around the points of the shoreline or around little islands out in the water. Next we have the crankbait. Now the crankbait's actually for diving down deep, and with a large lip on the front you can reel it down and hit the rocks pretty hard and get the bass worked up, and it'll actually prevent it from being snagged because the bill will run more down at this angle and bounce off the rocks, which will cause the bass to strike. And when bass are spawning, they're protective of the nest, and it really gets them aggressive and they'll really take some hard whacks at it. Most of the time I use darker colored crankbaits to imitate crayfish. Other people switch them up with brighter colors sometimes to imitate bluegill. I only do that if I'm running a short lip crankbait to keep the bait up high over the top of the fish and really give it a erratic retrieve, and that's more or less using it like a jerkbait, which I'll explain next. Here we have a jerkbait. What makes this different than a crankbait is they're longer and more slender. Some of them float on top of the water, some of them are suspenders, and when you use these guys you want a real erratic retrieve, so use a shorter rod, something like 6 foot, and get real snappy and count a few seconds in between to let the bait pause. And you always want to fish these guys above the level of the bass. Now the color for the jerkbait they say is really key. I like the gold guys in dirty water, and in real crystal clear water I like to get a shorter one. Probably I would say a good 3.5–4 inches in length, and a more like a blue or a black to imitate more of the bait fish that are there. Here we have a buzzbait. You can cover a lot of water with buzzbaits. You cast them out as far as you can and reel them in real fast. And what these do is they really track down the bass for you when they're getting aggressive. You'll see a big bass roll on it. Sometimes it's hard to hook up with the bass because they just whack at these and they don't really bite on. You can put a trailer hook on them to try to pick up the bass when they take a good whack at it, or you immediately retrieve it and you throw out a grub or a plastic right after that. Here we have a jig, the real hairy guys. You can use a variety of colors for jigs. I like blue and black or green and black. To slow the descent of your jig, when you cast it out and you want it to go slow before it hits the bottom, you add a pig, which is more presentation. It could be a rubber grub or these little square guys with the 2 little fins on the back. These work fairly good. To retrieve a jig, you cast it out and you bounce it across the bottom. It kind of imitates a crawdad. It's really Here we have a Terminator spinnerbait. Now what spinnerbaits are used for is imitating the bait fish. Depending on the skirt color, you can have orange or green to imitate a bluegill. The golden blades imitate more of a bluegill, versus the silver blades imitate more of a shad. And since the hook is buried inside the spinnerbait pretty deep, and when you retrieve it, it's almost weedless, so you can cast it through bushes, in and around stumps. It's a really versatile bait. Kevin Van Dam likes to use this bait a lot. Usually the skinnier blades are more to imitate longer, skinnier bait fish, versus the big round ones are to imitate bluegill and little fatter, chunkier, maybe tilapia. For an example, here's a bluegill imitating spinnerbait that I like to use. I call the big round ones thumper blades. Some guys refer to them as Colorado blades, and the skinny blades we call willows. They have multiple names for those guys too, but the gold and the big round ones, it causes a lot of noise inside the water, which really causes the bass to really key in and focus on it. This is more of a shad imitating spinnerbait that you want to throw out into water that's moving real fast around the corners where there's a good current and a good drop off where the bass are actually looking to target shad. You have skinnier blades that look and imitate the shad a little bit more. A little tiny thumper in the front here, give it a little bit of noise, and this is a fairly good bait. You can even catch striped bass with it too, but most spinnerbaits I use are for black. Here we have a spoon. I'm not really too big on casting spoons. The only time you really want to use a spoon is, say, if you have your fish finder and you see a little hill under the water, you know, a little point, and you'll see fish sitting above it just like a Christmas tree. And largemouth bass and smallmouth bass kind of sitting in order, so just lower your spoon to that exact depth on the depth finder and just bounce it around real slow. Now the knots that I like to tie on Topwater are Palomar knots. And remember, when you hook a fish using treble hooks, when you hook a largemouth using treble hooks, you really don't want to set the hook too hard because you don't really get a deep hook set on the fish. So by setting the hook too hard, you can pull it out. Basically just apply more pressure once you feel the fish on, and don't try to bulldog them in. So I would go with a Palomar knot on this. The crankbait, this is the same thing with the treble hooks. These are skinnier treble hooks. The smaller the treble hooks, the easier a fish can shake it, so you really don't want to set the hook too hard. Just speed up your retrieval. And I actually like to do the trilene knot on this, or a snail knot is fine, because the bait needs to really swim properly. Once again, with the jerkbait, I like to use a snail knot just to get the bait swimming properly. It's really key that this thing swims to the best of its potential. Now the buzzbait, which is a fast swimmer on top of the water, and when a fish hits this, generally they'll hit it extremely hard, so I think a Palomar is key to have on here. Now with my jigs, I also like to tie Palomar knots because they get caught up on tree branches and everything, and now and then you have to really yank on them real hard to get them out from behind branches and a Palomar net. Now with your spinnerbaits, I think it's really vital to have this swim properly and be able to turn the bait around logs and twigs and anything else you see sticking out of the water, so I like to go with a snail on this. Now since I'm not casting spoons most of the time, I'm just lowering it down to the bass. As you can see, there's a treble hook on here, so you want to follow that same principle as don't overset the hook, just keep some steady pressure on it. And lots of the time you see a little lip on here, so you don't want to tie a light knot if you are going to tie directly onto the plug. Tie a Palomar if you are going to tie on, or hook a swivel on here, a little silver swivel, and then tie onto that. I'm not sure if I covered that the longer the lip on your series of crankbaits here, like your jerkbait, this guy here, short lip, he's not going to swim very deep. The longer lip, he's going to swim deeper. Generally it'll say on the package when you get these guys what their depth is. Now this lure here is called a rattle trap. These also fall under the crankbait series. I don't particularly consider it a crankbait, but what this guy is designed for in particular, he's silver, so he's a shad imitator. You can get the red to imitate a crawfish. You can get the greens and the reds to imitate whatever it may be. You got to follow the same principle with the treble hooks, and definitely tie a Palomar knot on this, because the idea is you want to get it down in the grass and rip it out to cause a strike. And last but not least, we have a popper. This is designed to imitate a frog or a wounded fish. This falls under the Topwater plugs. The idea is on a popper, you cast it out there and you jerk it fairly hard, and the little opening in the front here catches a little bit of water and gives it a good popping noise. And when bass are active, it's hard for them to lay off of these, and it makes it really entertaining to get a good strike. Once again, dark colors for bright days and light colors. And I think that's pretty much it for covering the basics of bass lures. If you have any questions, please feel free to post a comment, and I will be quick as possible to answer it back to you. In the next segment, I will be covering plastic worms and grubs, Senkos, Zoom trick worms, you name it. Best of fishing.